Elio here with the Eorzean archives. Wow, what a patch! I'm going to be going through the majority of the MSQ, not exactly scene by scene, but touching on some major juicy lore bits that I noticed off the bat. Maybe talk about some of the things we might have seen coming and what it all portends for the future. So, spoilers ahead. This isn't meant to be a full review, and I won't be touching on Mists of the Realm, role quests, or tribal quests, which we'll have content on in the future. This video should be a fun dive into the most interesting aspects that we got from the MSQ. Oh, and forgive the footage of my personal character, patch day always breaks my tools. Let's get started. Getting into it, we get some much needed moment of quiet, and we spend it with Tataru. Sadly, it only lasts about half a second before we get pushed on to our next grand adventure. Though we don't get much in the way of new lore info, we get directed out to Thavnair by Tataru, and amid this we get foreshadowing of the bounty and its ruins as a callback from the memory of Emmet Selk in Ultima Thule. Maybe not of lore significance, but we also get more of Tataru's singing, which I'm always here for, as she sews together our new pocket-laden outfit, with which we prepare to explore the world. As we drift off to sleep to the sound of her working, this is where we get our first major mystery, a shadowed figure that wanders what seems like the void, and with the story that follows, as well as the sort of pseudo after-credits cutscene, we get a almost explicit confirmation that it is the void. The entity speaks, "Thus I am returned to this world, bereft of saviors," and we can clearly see it is the void scent with which Xenos made a pact as a Reaper. Whether this implies that Xenos died in Ultima Thule and his void scent was released back to the 13th, or something more vague, its phrasing frames it as self-sentient and remarking more on a homecoming, since as far as we know, Xenos never ventured onto the 13th. The focus upon its return is notable as well, because of its shape, which always kind of stood out compared to other void scent. A wild theory could be that it is in fact the shard of Azem of the 13th, or it could be nothing so concrete and just its own agent. The fact that we're pointed to it at the opening of the story and at the end of 6.1, and specifically we as the Warrior of Light would dream of it, means that there is some sort of connection beyond simple coincidence. Passing from outfit gathering to Thavnair on our search for ancient ruins, we get a professor drunk, just enough to find out about Al-Zadal, which is a major name to anyone familiar with Final Fantasy XI, and its associated dungeon, from which the 14 dungeon takes inspiration, mixed in with its own Thavnairian inspiration. Al-Zadal III, and the entire line he's associated with, shines a little light on the period of time when a Khan of the Zayla came to Thavnair and aided the Archosodra in pushing out the Gajasura, an event we know about and how it would cause fierce animosity from the Gajasura to the Zayla. But a deeper elaboration on this and details here were a fantastic piece for Atheris history nerds. Something that all too likely the Matanga tribe quest will build off of, even if not directly, as we're directed to find the treasure map to the vaults of Al-Zadal. Importantly, we also get allusions to his wealth being gained from other worlds, which will tie into the whole idea of the void later on. We get not only the object we seek and a reunion with Estinian, but the groundwork for the Khalzal Foundation, and the idea of sisters and brothers with the introduction of Mirand, and the acknowledgement that the events of Endwalker had fallout and lasting impacts. Things didn't just magically get better after the final days. Something you'd know if you did the side quests, but if not, it's made very explicit here in the MSQ. Another thing of note is that Estinian was recognizable as a hero of the final days on sight. Distinctive as he is, that's no surprise, but it's worth remembering that the Scions are known elements, even when disbanded. Speaking of acknowledging the final days, when Estinian shows he's after the treasure in order to aid people, it immediately called to mind our time in Scala. Funnily enough, directly after thinking that, he immediately compares what he's doing to our time and that. It's its own sort of fun nod to the length and breadth of our history. Optionally, we can also discover that Estinian claims to have learned how to better manage his coin purse, which is a dubious claim, for now. After securing a means of travel through some old friends like Matsia, and some further developments with Estinian and Merad, we decided it's best to get backup, and so we head out to find some of our fellow Scions, meeting first with Kryl and Graha as they work to rebuild the students of Baldessian. They tell us of tomes that they found both in Numenon and the Isle of Val, which we now know as Eureka. The mentions of Numenon continue to accumulate as it becomes vital to the rest of the patch. Kryl obliquely asks for our assistance with another task, which ends up being the setup to Myths of the Realm. Graha, however, attempts to not explode with sheer desire to go on an adventure with us, and as ever does the Mikote animation department run wild. Fun note is the way that Kral uses the friendly, close version of the Seeker of the Sun's name, by dropping the clan letter and referring to him as Raha, a fact that is not new, but it's cute if you haven't noticed it before. We also find out that Y'shtola has been delving into the Google library, seeking a way to other reflections, which comes as no surprise as it's been her stated goal ever since the events of 5.3, and her lingering around Matoya's cave post 6.0 makes the Google library as her location of study make all the more sense. As Google is far newer than Numenon, it has fewer resources. New Sharlayan has only been around some 2 centuries, compared to Old Sharlayan, who's been around close to 15 centuries. This all ties to the primary focus of 6.1, and likely 6.x as a whole, with the Void and cross-reflection travels. A small side idea referenced a few times in this story is the Loporrit's attempt to make the moon and its operations more friendly to the people of Atheris, which seems like a possible plot point or merely set up for the tribal quests. What's more is the possible implication of one day having moon housing, which may be a reality with astronomically low odds, but we can dream. With Graha in tow, we're off to get Y'shtola, and upon finding her asleep, all I could think is that her slumbering is probably going to end up being more than a few thumbnails among fellow YouTubers. The scene as a whole, with its music cutting out, is pretty fantastic. Y'shtola's studying any and every source she can get her hands on for a way to form a bridge between the source and the reflections. She's coming up with nothing. Which isn't surprising, as the only feat of that kind in drawing the scions to the first had insane prerequisites. The only regular crossing between reflections on any wide scale has only ever been between the Void and the Source, something we've known as far back as A Realm Reborn. Something that's really enjoyable throughout this patch is how much all the knowledge in it has been readily available up until now. 6.1 just goes out of its way to make it highly explicit, much like what Montaigne did during Endwalker and his lesson on aetherology. We always knew we'd be heading to the 13th, from the Crystal Tower, Warring Triad, Shadowbringers role quests, the Shadow of Mach Alliance raids, Eden, and more, so it's not a surprise that we're going there, and it's something that's been building up in the background for years. As we stop off to pick up Urianger, we also get a nod from Thancred, who references traveling and checking out Ilsabardian locales, and in the wake of Garlemald's fall, which will be a major plot element in the future, he's seen the small embers of chaos that have been left behind. We can look to places like Nalmask, Landis, Corvos, Wurlit, and many more to see places upon the central continent that may be struggling and will probably play key factors into 6.x and beyond. The fact that this is laid out as a background element for now is also probably why the twins have not been here to take center stage, as their primary focus has been dealing with Garlemald and helping out Euless. We also get one of 2 references to Thancred's teacher and mentor, the other being from an optional bit of dialogue from Y'shtola later on. This enigmatic teacher of espionage seems to be playing an ever greater role, though he may just remain a sort of Matoya, Montaigne-esque background character. With the group of scions in tow, and seeking the treasures of Alzadal's vault, the group dives on in. And like I said before, the whole thing is a Final Fantasy XIV take on the Final Fantasy XI location. The fact it's run by Forgekin as advanced as they are is interesting, especially with some of their designs being associated with groups like Alag with the Deathclaws, and the spatial teleportation abilities of some of the gate enemies, and how that kind of foreshadows what's to come. But the completion of the dungeon is when the lore and story kicks into high gear. The revelation that the vault primarily exists to protect a void gate is on one hand really cool and a little bit surprising, but not exactly shocking. With the purported claims of the wealth of the vault coming from other worlds, there were few options in what those other worlds could have been. The true intent of the void gate, on the other hand, is a twist. As a side mention, it should be noticed, it is best not to blame Y'shtola for any attempt at tampering with the seal, as she will talk with you later. For Jean's revelation that the true treasure of the vault is a void gate made with the intent in order to bring back Azdaia, and how the Great Worm was lost in the Third Astral Era during the war with Alag, changes our understanding of her absence up to this point. I can't help but feel some of the allusion to their sister not answering the call of the dragons feels a little misconstrued in light of this, but it doesn't actively contradict anything, and Reacher goes to lengths to explain his whole wording during Endwalker. Touches of Mericidia, the fact that the events of the stories like the Warring Triad and later Shadowbringers role quests are touched on, and may tie into the 13th, are all important, They potentially prep us for a 7.0. Now that could be a 13th oriented one, however the fact that we've gone so far in only one patch makes me think that 7.0 is far more likely to be terrestrial in nature, with a locale like Mericidia as the primary focus. 6.1 goes as far as getting us to the very door of the 13th itself, so there's a chance that everything with the Void might be resolved by the time that the patch content ends. The clarification we get between gates and fissures when it comes to the Void is also one of those apparent things in lore, if less so in story. 6.1 clearly is taking the time to clear up any confusion, especially for those who may have skipped side content, and everything surrounding events to do with the Void. And then we get to one of the most fascinating scenes. What seems to be in the Void based on the conversation and the arrival of the 4 Fiends and Golbez from Final Fantasy IV in their Final Fantasy XIV incarnation. This is my best guess based on their form, their elemental alignment, and their speech patterns, as well as their design, at least as far as Golbez is concerned. Not only at last do we see the form that our trial series might take, it's in a far more fascinating way than I could have imagined. We get nods to the idea that when we faced the Cloud of Darkness, it was not her at her full power, as she was held back by the Covenant with Xande, meaning we'll likely see her again. The real meat is what pressing matters the Fiends could be referring to in their conversations to each other. Having waited 10,000 years means that they have been waiting for this literally onto the creation of the 13th, as it was the first reflection to be attempted to be rejoined by the Ascians. The failure of this means that it never was rejoined, and so this event must have happened pre the first Umbral Calamity. Their understanding and acknowledgement of the Warrior of Light, and how we might stand in their way, brings into question if we are part of the requirements of their plan, or if something else has at long last kicked it off, like the death of Zodiark and the removal of the Ethereal Shroud. According to Golbez, and determined to set a war in motion to win redemption for their star, could it be that the goal is to restore the 13th? Or maybe this is misdirection and this isn't the Void at all, and simply another reflection. Though there's much in more detail to go into, the remainder of the patch can be simplified. It centers around the creation and aid for those who lost so much during the events of the final days through the creation of the Khalzal Foundation. The other big events are the recognition that the warding scales created for tempering might prevent our Aether from being corrupted by the Void itself. But most vital is when we dive into Numenon's restricted section, where we discover ancient notes referring to Atmos, an enemy that you might recall from places like the World of Darkness. It turns out that Atmos might operate as a means by which to expand the Void Gate for easy and ready access. The notion introduced here of an artificial void scent, on one hand, is an idea that has existed elsewhere in canon. Hell, the kobolds breed bombs, though that I guess is technically more of a natural phenomenon. The idea to use warding skills too is brilliant use of already existent tools without having to make a contrivance for further protection from the Void. Though, having to make armor for your magical armor is a little funny. Testing all of this is when we get our meme moment of the patch, and I have nothing to say here other than, water, water, froth and foam! So coming down to some of the final points I have. We have Vritra coming to terms with his torn heart on saving Hydaelyn, and the people of Razat Han wanting him to find peace. The emotions of this whole patch are lovely, however, I fear for the reality of when we do find Hydaelyn after 5,000 years in the Void. As strong as dragon scales may be, they can only last for so long. So that about wraps up this really general overview for touching on the lore of 6.1. A hell of a patch that really feels like it did 2 patches of setup. Its extreme focus on the Void is fascinating, especially if it intends to lead into a Void-based 7.0, which to me seemed unlikely, and I have to question if such a thing would even need 5 patches of setup. But that's speculation for the next few days and weeks as we dive deeper. Until then, see you next time. This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday, and comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon.